Okay, welcome on my newest video. I got so much reactions on my last post about the age of the Keris and when the Keris was founded that it stimulates me to give a little bit clarification about the three different philosophies about the Keris. I already told you that the first group is talking about the modern Keris, so the Keris like this, being founded in, let's say, sometime the 12th century, going back to the 12th century, so 1100. The second group, and I'm in the middle, you know, I think that the modern Keris is founded so in the middle of 1350. And then you've got the last group, and with the last group you're actually talking about physical proof, so old Kerises that can be dated, the temples and the stones with stories about the life in Indonesia at the time, mostly wayang-like pictures, you know, created into the chandis in Indonesia. So what I wanted to do right now is give a little bit of explanation where it comes from. The first group, who's mentioning the modern Keris going back in time, comes from Holland. And a very important book about the Keris is of course this book from Tammens, written by Tammens. And if you read the book, quite in the beginning, this is interesting. When he wrote his book, he not only went to a lot of museums, he did a lot of research. In his book he mentions also another big Dutch developer of the knowledge of the Keris, Groneman, who came from Deventer. And in the time from Tammens, he went to museum, he did a lot of research, but he also talked with a lot of Indonesian people who left Indonesia, because you have to understand that in the beginning, let's say, of the foundation of the Republic of Indonesia, a lot of people with Keris were picked up by the government and being killed. So a lot of people who believe in the Keris went to the Netherlands, and that's why here in the Netherlands there are a lot of people who still believe in the old belief of the Kejawen with the Keris, because they left Indonesia. And this is signed by one of the persons who also helped him write the book, and we spoke a lot about the Keris. It's Mr. Dieper Suot. He was one of the old specialists of the Keris, and I've got some pictures. This is at my house, together with Rudy, and this is Dieter. And we talked a lot about the Keris, not only about the external of the Keris, the things that you see, age, etc., but actually mostly about the traditions of the Keris. This is another nice picture. This is at Rudy's home in Amsterdam. And again, we've been talking a lot about the Keris. I got a reaction on my website, and it was Dieter, who wanted to speak me and talk about the Keris, and that's how we got to know each other. And as thank for our friendship, he gave me this book from Tammens. And a lot of the stories from Tammens are the stories that he heard from people, I should not say on the streets, but the stories that cannot be confirmed. And in the beginning of his book, he's even speaking about a curved Keris from the age 400, because Groneman wrote in one of his books that there was curved Kerises 400 according to the European time frame. And inside his book he also mentioned Kerises who are older than the 13th century, so we're speaking about the 12th century. And that's where the knowledge in Holland came from, by dating Keris very, very early. So what did I do? I created a timeline. Let me show you the timeline over here. And on that timeline are a couple of very interesting things about the Keris and development of the Keris. Let's start here, at this side here. And that's actually the start of the first time that things in Indonesia are being written down. And we're speaking about 352 BC, after AD, I'm sorry, 58 AD. What happened at that time? In West Java, in Banten, there are, I think, 7 lingams like this. And on the lingams, not in Kawi but Sanskrit, in Indian, you can read who created those lingams and where they came from. So if you talk about the Keris, and the Keris is founded in the Hindu time in Indonesia, then it's quite interesting to know when the first Hindus came to Indonesia, and that's 358, because in 358 it was a king, Jayasinghavarman, who came from Selangkiana in India and founded a Hindu kingdom in West Java. His son married to the Sundanese princess, and so their children were mixed from India and from Sundanese, Banten region, and they founded the first Hindu kingdom in Indonesia. You have to understand that in animistic belief, so the Javanese at that people, they believed that on top of the hills, that's the place of the ghosts, the gods, but also your ancestors. And in India, at that moment, they had exactly the same belief. So what you see over here, this is the holy mountain from India, the Mount Kailash. In Indonesia, they call it Meru. And what happened is that Shiva, Brahma and Vishnu, they took a part of the mountain and brought it to Indonesia. And that's Mount Semeru, the holy mountain of Indonesia. And on top of the mountain, that's the place of the ghosts. Well, it's no coincidence that the Gunung, mountain, and the tree of life, this is typical Indonesian, but check the shape of the blade. It's symmetrical, and on top, that's the place of the ghosts, the gods, your ancestors. It's on top of the Gunungan, and that goes back to the holy mountain, as well as, oh, this is the glossy side here, as well in where is Himalaya? It's in Himalaya, as in Indonesia, the Mount Semeru. And the symbol for Shiva and the mountain is a lingam. And the first lingam came from Indonesia. It's the picture that I showed to you with the inscription in Sanskrit telling you exactly when they came from India and where they founded the first Hindu kingdom in Indonesia. So going back to the timeline, it's quite interesting to see. And if you check this weapon, at the moment they don't call it a Keris because it's symmetrical. But if I turn it around and look at the shape and check the Gunungan, and you can see that it's exactly the same shape. So this is a Keris. It is a representation of the holy mountain. But it has a pommel here. And you can only hold it in a downward grip. And if you check the temples, the old temples, let's say the Borobudur, something about 750, and the Chandis, you know, the old Chandis of Indonesia. And if you check the Chandis, that's coming from the Prambanan, you see a monkey. Let me put it a little bit closer. And it's also holding the Gunungan in a downward way. So the point is going down. A lot of people say that the modern Keris is the slender type of Keris, and I don't really agree. You have to understand that Europeans are very visual, and they're also very good in analyze things, select things. For instance, if I've got a book about acupuncture, I rather read a book from a Frenchman, because it's quite easy. He puts it in chapters and it's easy to read. If you read the Chinese books, then you have to scroll at the beginning, oh, what is the meaning, and go back and have to do a lot of searching. It's not about good or bad. I live in Europe. I'm born and raised in Europe. And it's clear that European people and Indonesian people, they've got another culture of thinking. And it's not about good or bad, but in my opinion, if you read a book from the Keris, what is written by a European, it's very structured, because that's in their culture, you know. But it also means Europeans are very visual, and you know, there are some top collectors. They've got some top Keris coming from high-rank soldiers and governors from Indonesia. They don't change anything. But there are also very, very good Keris, and if they check the books and they see that something is not correct, like a mendak, they change it without thinking why the owner did use another mendak, for instance, you know. That's typical European. Visual is very important. But if I look at the Keris, it's the internal thing. It's the belief in the Keris, belief in the energy, belief in kejawen. And for me, the modern Keris is the Keris that they start holding it upwards. So the pommel was gone here, and with the pommel they could only hold the Keris like this. But it had the shape of the holy mountain, of the Gunungan. Gunung is Indonesian for mountain. And at the moment that they start using the Keris upward, so also the what they call the Keris Buddha at this time, that for me is the modern Keris. And it's interesting to see that even in the old times, on the old temples, that they already used Keris, but then holding it downward. So if you look at the legends like that, then it's much more plausible that there were already Keris, like the story of Groneman, who told that there is a curved Keris already at 400 AD. And then you can discuss about, was it curved or not? But you have to understand that at the time, a lot of stories were only written down or carved in stone in the temples. If you check, for instance, the stories from China, and you make movies of those old stories, and you project the movies directly, you see some people who make jumps of 20 meters. Well, it's impossible. But you have to understand that it's written in a kind of poetry where you try to give extra force, because you didn't have movies, you didn't have a music on the background or light to make the standpoint more clear. At that time, things were only written or carved in stone. So it could be plausible, if you look at this time and the first time that the Hindus entered Indonesia, 358 that indeed 400 AD that there were Keris. But they are not called Keris because they are symmetrical. You don't have, for me, the external thing of the Keris is not important, it's the internal thing. And it looks exactly like the Gunungan, so for me it's a Keris. The Keris is probably founded, the old Keris in that time. That kingdom from India, well, the stones are still there, so they could carve in stones. And it's very plausible that his complete kingdom from India came to Indonesia, and that was time that also the temples could be built. If I go back to the timeline, one thing is very interesting. In a certain time, and let me go to this picture over here, there is a story about Raden Panji. And they say that Raden Panji, that he brought wayang and the Keris to Indonesia. And he came by boat. He came by moon boat, because the boat was shaped like a moon. And this is maybe quite interesting. This is one of my oldest sheets, warangka of the Keris, one of my oldest that I have. It's not as big as the modern type of warangka. It's a small warangka, but it is old. It's really old. You can see the wood. And it looks like a ship, especially the old ones look very much like a ship. And the story goes that not only Raden Panja brought the Keris to Indonesia, but he came by boat. And at this day they still call it warangka. In the old Polynesian language, wanga means canoe. And the old people in Indonesia, like in Borneo or Papua New Guinea, they call a boat wanga. So wanga, warangka, it's very close to each other. So it's very, and when somebody, this is interesting, when somebody dies, it's the boat that brings his soul to the place where the spirits live. So let me go back to the picture to make it a little bit more clear. And if you look very carefully, you can see that he's sitting some kind of jongkok, on his knees in the boat, bringing his soul to the world of the ghosts. Well, a Keris does exactly the same. A Keris also brings your soul to the place where the gods live, to the supernatural thing. That's quite interesting. So we're talking about the history and the story about King Panji, the 12th century, 1190. And 60 years later, we got the Book of the Kings, talking about King Ken Arok and Empu Gandring. Quite interesting. So it's very plausible that the upright Keris, what I call the modern Keris, the type of the Keris Buddha, so the time that they start turning the Gunungan around and wearing it upside, so to the top, because of the grip that they changed, that it happened around 1190. And Raden Panji, Prince Panji, is very, very important in the history of Indonesia. So let me go back. We talked about Hinduism and the belief in Hinduism that the gods live on top of the mountains, the movement from Mount Kailash to Indonesia, Meru to Semeru. The lingam, this is a lingam from Yogyakarta, and the use of a Keris-like object, but it is symmetrical. But I call that the old Keris, and I call the modern Keris the Keris with the point up. What is also interesting, and if you check this picture over here, the first time that a Keris has been shown with the point up is in the Candi Panataram. You can read it. Candi Panataram. And in the Candi Panataram, we're talking about 1300. So let's say around 1200, just before 1200, Raden Panji, and the story that he's the one who brought the Keris to Indonesia and wayang. Then we've got the story of Ken Arok, the book of the kings. And oh yeah, and what is the book that they're talking about? Old Indonesian books are made out of palm leaves, and they burn the text in Kawi, in Indonesian, in those books. I got a very old one. I bought it from a museum, a coin museum in, where was it? Zutphen, somewhere there. And it was a very old book. And let me show it to you. I've got it over here. And this is such an old book. You know, sometimes in Holland, the old museums, they sell objects so they can buy new objects. And this is one of the objects that I bought over there. And you can see in those old books that they wrote it down in Kawi. Here you can see it. So this is very precious for me. I keep it here closed in my tempat Keris. It's a very old book. And the Book of Kings, with the life and the story of King Ken Arok, was also written on a book like this. These books are also holy, you know. So we talked about the Candi Panataram, the first time that a Keris is shown in the upright position. And we're talking about around the time of 1200. It's clear that between 1200 and 1250, so the story of Ken Arok, that something happened there in Indonesia. And especially the time of Mataram, between Majapahit and Mataram, something happened and the Keris came into Indonesia. In Mataram, the most beautiful Keris are being made in that period, but the most powerful, energetic, magical Keris are made in Majapahit. Majapahit, let's say 1290 to 1500. In the beginning, so let's say 1300 to 1400, the Keris from Majapahit were the Keris Buddha, and the most beautiful example of it is the Keris Knout. This Keris, and it is in the Museum of Amsterdam, Keris Knout. And it has a typical shape, you know, with a ditch here in the middle. Very interesting to know that in the Majapahit Museum in East Java, there's also a statue who has exactly the same Keris, with also that little ditch inside. How do we know that the Keris from Knout is from that time? Quite simple, it has a date on it. It's dated 1342. European time, 1342. So it's very plausible that that is the type of Keris being used in Majapahit. But when did the first Keris appear? And that's quite interesting. Because let's go a little bit here, like this. And on top you see a straight Keris. That's a Sideman Keris. And the Sideman Keris is quite interesting because the story goes that Gajah Mada, you know, Gajah Mada, he was the famous general and advisor for the king. And he actually made the great expansion of Indonesia happened from East Java and then expanding all over Southeast Asia. Well, I printed an example of the Sideman Keris here. And if you look closely, you can see it has Wayang figures on it. Let me put it like this maybe. The Sideman Keris is quite interesting because it has been given to a king from Bali, and it has been by the king surely until 1900. This is the only picture that I could find about the Sideman Keris. And what makes it so interesting, that it's already a slender modern type of Keris. And just like the Keris of Knout, it has Wayang figures on it. It's clear that Pamor did not appear on the Keris, let's say 14th century. Keris before the 14th century, there is no evidence that the Keris before 14th century has Pamor. What they do have is those Wayang figures on it. And just like the Keris of Knout, also this Keris has the Wayang figures on it. If you go back in time, then you can, let's say, date this Keris around, let's say 1500. No, 1400, I'm sorry, 15th century, so 1400. So it means that between 1400 and let's say 1500, the modern Keris has been created. That's what we can prove. That's what we can surely prove with the books, a combination of the old books, combination of the Keris that are still here, about the combination of the stories that we know about the Keris. And it's clear that if you go here, we go here to the end, that not only the Sideman Keris, but also the Keris from Johann Jacob Good von Schultz, that came, let's say, from the last part of Majapahit, so let's say 1450 to 1500, around that time, then you can see curved Keris. And that's the time when the first Pamor arrived. And it's not clear of the Keris being washed at the time. I don't think so. There is no proof that Keris has been washed at that time, but they have been made layered. So this is quite interesting. And if you go to the end, of course, then you see the paintings of Rembrandt. We're talking about 1629, and in that time of Rembrandt, you know, you see the real Keris as we know the Keris right now. So what does it tell me? I wanted to give a little bit explanation. So the first group who's talking about Keris before 1300, even 12th century, that comes from the book from Groneman, and people adopted it and translated it a little bit. So it's not a lie, it comes from some kind of book, but it is not really proven that modern Keris was there. For instance, if you talk about still in the museum in Amsterdam, there is a little difference in, let's say, the timeline when you compare it with Indonesia. And if you check some old Keris and some dates that are used, even in Amsterdam Museum, they go back 200 years before what I'm telling here, because I'm actually using the information from Indonesia and the dates of the temples. Okay, so let's go back to the timeline again. After 300, the first Hindus came. They took their belief of the holy mountain, and the Keris is the holy mountain, representation of Shiva. Raden Panji, let's say around 1200, who brought the Keris to Indonesia, and I think that he brought the modern Keris with the point up. And then you get the first stories about the Keris. You're talking about Ken Arok and Empu Gandring. Then you see the temples and this Keris of Knout that can be dated. So that's quite simple. because we're talking about, let's say, 1350. Then between 1350 and 1400, we got the first straight Keris, evidence of the first straight Keris. So let's say between 1400 and 1450, and between 1450 and 1500, the first curved Keris. And just to be sure, the Keris from the straight Keris like here, before, let's say 1400, the Keris didn't have palmar. They didn't have palmar. And well, I've got two old Keris, but I really don't know how old it is because there's no clear evidence of Keris of that time. Well, I showed you the Keris in the beginning. Let me show you another Keris. Very important Keris for me. This is also a very old Keris. If you check the form, it has a little bit of broad form, what you see in the Keris Buddha. It don't have palmar because Keris from that time simply do not have palmar. So you should also not wash the Keris like this because it's not meant to be washed. It could be that this is a Keris, let's say, from the beginning of time, from Majapahit, so 1400 between 1500. But there is no evidence. I like to believe that it's like that. And I've been walking around in the collector's world for almost 20 years. And this is one of the rare Keris that I kept. All the other Keris, I had a lot of Keris also from Mataram. I sold them because for me it's the internal of the Keris and not the external of the Keris. But this is one of the Kerises that I kept. Thank you very much for watching.